All right, today we're going to be wrapping up a series we've been in the last few weeks, and I'll get to that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about something that happened not too long ago. This fall, I had an opportunity. It was a lot of fun. I had an opportunity. It was with a larger group of people to go to a place in Atlanta called Trilith Studios. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's actually just outside of Atlanta in a town called Trilith. I won't name his name, but you can Google it and you'll see who it is. There's a billionaire, that's with a B, there's a billionaire who built this studio and then decided, you know what, we probably need a town here too. So he built a town. Who just goes, I think I should build a town? He just built a town out in the middle of fields, just built a town. About 2,000 people live in this town now. And the Trilith Studios has, it may be more now, at the time I was there, it had 31 different sound stages. And if I started listing all the movies and all the TV shows that are shot here, you know them all. I mean, this is 3 of the top 10 grossing movies of all time were shot here at Trilith. All the Marvel stuff, if you're a big Marvel fan, it's all there. As a matter of fact, there was an entire warehouse there that was nothing but Marvel props. And unfortunately, it was locked. Well, I checked. It was locked. You couldn't get in. They did not want you in there, but I thought that would have been really cool to get in there. So anyway, they've shot all this stuff. So this guy who built all of this, he spent a couple hours that morning we were there. We spent a whole day there. He spent a couple hours with us, talking to us, answering questions. He was super gracious and kind, and learned a lot from him. And then they gave us a tour of the entire complex. Now, this guy who owns it, he was telling us about all the development he was doing. There were cranes everywhere and bulldozers. I mean, they were building all kinds of stuff. So he's telling us about all the stuff he's doing. And then we go on the tour, and what was kind of weird is when we got on the tour, all 31 sound stages were empty. There was nothing happening there. And the reason there was nothing happening is some of you may remember last fall, the actors were on strike and the writers were on strike. So there was, for 5 months, at this point when I was there, it had been 5 months of nothing happening. And so at one point, I look at my buddy who's with me, and I'm like, hey, I don't get it, because I was running numbers in my head, right? I was like, I don't get it. He has had zero revenue for 5 months, and he didn't even seem stressed this morning, you know? And my buddy looked back at me and said, Matt, basically, he's like, you're an idiot. When you have $9 billion, you don't stress about losing a few $1 million. And that is the moment when I realized I do not think like a billionaire at all. Because you're right. As I started doing the math, it seemed like huge numbers to me, and I was like, well, you hadn't even hit $1 billion yet, so he's not worried at all. But it was a great lesson for me in the sense of it reminded me of this. And I think this is true for you too. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. This is just something that's true for all of us, that how you think impacts what you do. Isn't that right? How you think always impacts what you do. In that particular instance, as I was looking around at everything, calculating numbers and thinking about, okay, no revenue 5 months, I had a complete scarcity mindset. I was thinking, oh my gosh, limited resources and you're losing, which created all kinds of fear. It wasn't even my fear, right? It wasn't even my problem, but I was just like, how's this guy so calm? How's he so relaxed when he's losing so much money for 5 months in a row? But this guy, he did not have a scarcity mindset. That's what $9 billion will do for you, apparently. He had an abundance mindset. And by that, I mean, he wasn't worried about the money. Where I saw potential issues or problems, he saw great opportunity. He was like, oh yeah, nobody's going to be in these studios for 5 months. This is amazing. We can make all kinds of improvements. We can spend all kinds of money developing out other stuff. It was his way of thinking led him to a course of action that would have been totally different than my way of thinking in the moment. And the truth is, this happens to all of us. You have a certain way of thinking that drives what you do, that impacts all the decisions you make. The problem is, I don't know if it's a problem, but the problem is that it runs behind the scenes. It's kind of like software running on your laptop that you never pay attention to. You never notice. Your way of thinking is always causing you to behave in certain ways and to make certain decisions and to move your life in certain directions, and you're not even aware, and I'm not either. It's not a criticism. We're just not even aware that there's this software running that's causing us to do all of this. We never pause to actually think or identify what our way of thinking is and if it's leading us in the direction that we actually want to go. And so my question to you would be, where is your mindset taking you? Where's your way of thinking leading you? What's your way of thinking causing you to do? So we're in the 4th and final week of this series we've been in called Love Money and the American Way. And the thing that is underlying in this entire series is the fact that as human beings, we all want to be happy. You know that. I mean, it's a big deal for all of us. There's nothing wrong with that. We all value happiness. We all want to be happy in life, which is why I ask you, if you could change one thing about your life that you think would make you happier, what do you think it would be? And interestingly enough, for the vast majority of us, we give very similar answers to that question. And whatever our answer is, that's our leverage point. A leverage point is just something in your life or something in a system that if you improve it, it improves a lot of stuff. And all of us tend to think pretty similarly about the leverage points that will make us happier in life because it's the American way. It's the American way to think, well, if I want to be happier in life, then something has to change in this circle or this category of love. That's really important. Something's got to change here in my relationships, not romantic necessarily, but you probably start thinking, oh, if that relationship would be better, I'd be happier. Or we think something needs to happen with my money. Something's got to happen financially because if that would improve or that would change in this way, I think I'd be happier. And you're probably not wrong in the sense that it would make you happier, but I also probably don't have to convince you that happiness usually doesn't last, does it? Because you get it and you're happy for a minute and then there's something else you want to have change. We all had a moment in our lives, at least if you're younger, you're not there yet maybe, but for most of us, we had a moment in our lives, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, at some point in the past, where we wished and dreamt and hoped for the day of today. In other words, you were hoping you would end up in a place in life that you actually are right now, but you're still looking to change something else because it doesn't lead to lasting happiness. And the reason it doesn't is because there's one thing that we humans want more than happiness, and it's meaning. It's meaning. We want to wake up every day and know we're making a difference. We want to wake up every day and know that what we're doing is significant. We want to wake up every day with a sense of purpose. We don't want to think life is random and we're just going through the motions and it doesn't really matter. We want meaning. We want happiness, but we want meaning too. And the good news is you can have both of them. But it's why when Jesus was on the earth and he would talk to people about their relationships or their money, and he talked about those things all the time because they're so important. But he would never stop with, oh, just here's what you do to make that relationship better and you're good. Oh, here's what you do. Here's a simple plan with your money and then you're fine. Because he knew that was just going to give some momentary happiness. So Jesus would actually always come back to a deeper, more foundational leverage point. He would always come back to this idea of trust. Because trust influences everything you do. The object of your trust always determines where you end up in life. It determines the outcome of your journey. And so Jesus would always look at people and go, okay, I know you're thinking about that relationship, but actually, let's think about who you're trusting in terms of your approach, your mindset, your way of thinking to impact that relationship. Because if we can adjust that, if we can make the object of your trust the right person, the right plan, the right approach, well, it'll give you more than just momentary happiness. It'll actually give you meaning. Today, we're going to wrap up by spending a little bit more time talking about this relationship between trust and money. And this is not, I'll say it again, I said it last week, it's not something where I'm trying to get you to give something. That's not where we're going with this. This is all about meaning because there's a significant connection between your money and the amount of meaning you experience in your life. So I want you to think for a second, because we never think about this. I want you to think for a second about who or what you trusted enough to shape your way of thinking when it comes to your money and possessions. If we can just zoom out, big picture, 30,000 foot view, and you began to evaluate or analyze the way you think about money, because we all have a way we think about it. It's running in the background. Where did you get that? For a lot of you, it came from growing up, because you've only seen what you've seen, right? So as you got older, you just started emulating or imitating exactly what you saw growing up. And you have a very similar approach to money and possessions that you saw before you. Not a criticism, it's just the way it was. You can't imagine there's anything else out there that's any better than what you've had. Now, there's some of you that you grew up and it was so terrible or so stressful or so rough that you just swore to yourself, when I get older, I'm never going to be in that position financially. So what did you do? When you got older, you walked away from that plan. You walked away from that model. You didn't trust it. But you found someone you did trust, and you began following their plan. And you allowed that person's way of thinking to influence and impact and shape your way of thinking. But again, it's just so natural. We don't even realize it's going on. But it's actually influencing not just what we do with our money and possessions, it influences what we do with everything. Which is why when you read the accounts of Jesus' life, it is fascinating to begin to try to read and understand Jesus' view on money and possessions. The reason I say it's fascinating, that's being polite, because a lot of times we read it and we're like, that just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense what he says about it because he has a way of thinking very different than our way of thinking. And the way you think determines what you do. So the things he asks us to do when it comes to money and possessions make no sense to us because we don't think the way he thinks. We think the way we think, which is why the things we do make sense to us, even if they're not leading us in the direction we want to go. So what I want to do as we wrap this up is I want to show you a fictional story, a made-up story. It's called a parable that Jesus told his followers one day, trying to help them have a breakthrough in how they thought about money and possessions, because they were no different than us. Jesus tells this story to try to, if you will, flip everything upside down for them. And I'll just warn you, this story, it's going to mess with your head a little bit, in a good way, but it's going to mess with your mind a little bit, because apparently the way Jesus thought about whatever we own and possess was just so countercultural to the way we tend to think. So I'll read you the story, and then we'll talk about what this looks like personally, potentially, for you and for me. Here's the story he told. He said, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions, which I always chuckle. I'm like, well, you're kind of out of my league already. So there was a guy who was so wealthy that he needed to hire somebody to do nothing but manage all of his wealth, all of his assets, okay? So if you have a financial advisor, it's kind of like that, but this is a step beyond. Like this guy was managing the entire estate. And apparently, the wealthy owner has a very wasteful manager. And so, word gets around, word eventually gets to him. He must not have been paying careful enough attention, but he realizes, oh man, he's not managing my money very well. So, here's what Jesus says he does. He called in the manager and he asked him, what's this I hear about you? People have been coming telling me. Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. In other words, I don't know everything you've been doing, but I've heard enough to know I'm concerned. I've heard enough to know you've been negligent. So I want you to go get the books, and I want you to come back. We're going to have another meeting. You're going to walk me through exactly where everything is that I own, exactly the state of my wealth, and then you're fired. This is basically what the guy says, and then you're fired. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a moment where you lost a job or you were fired from a job, you got laid off, but you can imagine. If you lose your job, what is the dominant first thought you're going to have as you're walking out the door? I'll tell you what it is. How am I going to eat and live indoors? That's really what you care about first. I just want to make sure I keep eating and living indoors. That's exactly what this guy clearly is thinking, because as he walks out the door, Jesus says the manager said to himself, okay, what should I do now? Because this is urgent. I'm about to lose my job. My master's taking away my job. This makes me chuckle every time. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm not doing manual labor. He was not from West Kentucky. I'm not doing manual labor. Some white-collar dude. Not strong enough to dig. And he says, and I'm too proud. I'm way too ashamed to beg. I'm not about to beg for help. I'm not doing that. And then a plan hits him. So he says, okay, I know what I'll do. So that when I lose my job here, because it's going to happen, but when I do, people are going to welcome me into their houses. So he's walking along. He thinks, I got to figure out how to plan for the future. And I got to plan for the future quickly because an uncertain future is coming really fast. He says, I know what I'll do. And here was his plan. Jesus says this next. He says he called in each one of his master's debtors. So back then, first century, this would have been normal. The very wealthy people often served as banks, if you will, for other folks. So if you needed a loan, you needed some help with something, you could go to a wealthy individual. You could work out a deal, get a loan from them. So this wealthy owner has a big, long list of people who owe him things, right? And this manager, the owner, doesn't even know who all owes him. The manager does, because he's been handling it all. So this manager's like, I can do something about this. So he pulls out his list of all the people who owe his owner. He starts making phone calls. So Jesus says the first one, he calls the first one. And he asks him, how much do you owe my master? Well, 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. Apparently olive oil was big business back then. I don't know. I don't know what I would do with that. But anyway, 900 gallons of olive oil. And this is the genius part. The manager looks back at him and he says, take your bill, sit down quickly. Let's make it 450. Now this guy who owes 900 gallons has no idea what's going on, that this manager is about to lose his job. But the manager is thinking, I know what I'll do. I'll call some of these people in and I'm going to forgive part of their debt. So he does. He said, I'm going to forgive half your debt. We're just going to change it right now. You only owe $450. Are you serious? Yeah, I'm serious. Oh my gosh, I don't know how to thank you. He's like, well, I might holler at you later. It's like, appreciate it. Now out the door he goes. Then, second guy shows up for his appointment, okay? He asks the second one, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he said. The manager looks back at him and he says, okay, take your bill, make it 800. The guy's like, sure, okay, that's awesome, thank you. And he forgives a little bit of the debt. Now, we read this and we think, this is terrible. How could this guy possibly do this? And let me just remind you, Jesus has already told us he's dishonest. What do dishonest people do? Dishonest things, that's exactly right. But as you're reading the story, you're like, oh my gosh, once the owner finds out, this guy's gonna get it. It's gonna go from bad to worse. And sure enough, the owner does find out because you can't hide things from people ever. It must have been a small town, right? Word gets around. So word got around. And after the second meeting with the second person who owed, the owner finds out and he immediately calls him in. Now, what do you expect the owner to say? You expect him to be furious. You expect him to figure out how to punish this guy for what he's done. But Jesus was great at telling stories, and every story Jesus told, there was always a twist somewhere, because this is where he wanted to make his point. So Jesus says, sure enough, the owner finds out. He calls the manager back in. But here's what happens. Jesus said, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. That's a word we don't use very often. To which I'm sure the manager's like, you're not mad at me? The owner's like, well, yeah, I'm a little mad. I had to get you in here and put an end to this before you did a lot of damage. Fortunately, you only did this with 2 people. But this is pretty impressive. You knew you were about to lose your job. You knew you were going to be out on the street. You knew you hadn't planned and prepared accordingly for the future. And you were wise enough, you were slick enough, you were sharp enough, you were shrewd enough to come up with a way to start forgiving debts I didn't know about, so you could earn favor with people that when you lost your job, you could call on them and they'd give you a meal. You could call on them, they'd give you a place to stay. You could call on them, they might even give you a job. Well done. Well done. I mean, totally dishonest, but well done in your dishonesty. Because you were thinking about the future and you figured out how to take care of yourself that quick. Now, we're all reading this, and I think Jesus' followers that day are listening to him, kind of scratching their heads like, so what's the point? We should try to cheat people? Like, I don't. Jesus goes, no. Here's the point. This is where it gets personal for us. Jesus looks at his followers. He looks at all of us who follow him. He says, I want you to understand something about how you should think about everything that you own. He says the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. What he was saying was this. He was saying there are people who don't follow me, and this was so common in the first century. The people who don't follow me don't believe in an eternity. They believe in a finite amount of time that they get to live their lives. They believe that when they die, it's just over. And even though they don't believe in anything beyond this life, they put so much effort, so much thought, so much work into planning ahead for their very finite future. They're so creative. They're so intentional about making sure that they are prepared and ready and in a good position when they get further into their finite future. And Jesus says, here you are, and you believe in an eternity. You believe in an infinite future. You believe you're going to live forever somewhere. You're going to live forever with me, Jesus would say. But they're putting more intention in planning for their future than you are in planning for theirs. To which we might have gone, well, no, wait a minute, Jesus, no. I took care of my future because I asked you to forgive me of my sins. You know, I prayed a prayer. I did what I know I'm going to go to heaven. Jesus goes, no, that's great, but you're missing the whole point. This isn't about where you're going to spend eternity. This is about planning for your experience in eternity. And you are not planning. You're giving less effort than all those people who all they care about is how much they have in their retirement. You're not even thinking about eternity. And now at this point, I think they're all scratching their heads like, well, I just thought we were supposed to make sure we were going to be with God. He says, no, there's stuff beyond that that you should think about. For instance, he says, I want to give you some instruction. I tell you, use worldly wealth. That's just all the stuff you and I have, right? Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. So that when it's gone, because it's all temporary, we already know this, you're not going to keep it forever. But when it's gone, if you use it the right way, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now they're really confused. So how does that work, Jesus? But here's what he taught. And I can't fully explain all this. But he taught that you can store up for yourself treasure in heaven. And the way you do that is by taking temporary things that you own and investing what you have into things that are eternal. When I take money, when I take possessions, and I use them for an eternal purpose, it's like storing up treasure in heaven. So what does that mean? Well, let me ask you this. What's eternal? God's purposes in the world are eternal. Helping introduce people to Jesus is eternal. Helping people know him better and grow in their faith is eternal. The church is eternal. People are eternal. So when you take your money, your possessions, and you invest them into people or purposes that are eternal, Jesus says, oh man, you have just done something extraordinary. You have stored up for yourself treasure in heaven. And he says, one day when you show up in heaven, you're going to be welcomed by people. I think this is a beautiful part of this picture. You're going to be welcomed by people that in some cases you didn't even realize you helped. But you gave to that, or you loaned your things to that, or you leveraged those assets to help in those ways. And there are going to be people who walk up to you and say, I'm here because of you. I'm here because my life was different because of you. That's what he means by you're going to be welcome. There are going to be people who can't wait to see you when you step into eternity, because what you did had an eternal impact. The way you use your worldly wealth gained friends for yourselves in eternity. And then, while everybody's head was spinning, Jesus says, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. He says, first of all, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Isn't that the way it works? And of course, all of us would be like, well, yeah, that's how we think. That's the way it works. And whoever's dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much, right? Well, yeah, of course. You're not going to trust somebody with a lot if they're not trustworthy with a little. Jesus says, okay. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who's going to trust you with true riches? Now, obviously, we know what worldly wealth is, but clearly Jesus seems to be talking about some type of true riches that are different than the wealth we have on this earth, which means this has to be some type of eternal riches. You say, Matt, can you explain to me exactly what that is? No, I cannot. I have no idea, okay? But I know this. I know over and over again, Jesus would teach his followers, depending on how you think and what you do with your life, will determine the way you are rewarded in eternity. And everybody's not rewarded the same way. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that's going to mean. But apparently, according to Jesus, you got all this worldly wealth that we all care about so much and we focus on. And he's going, you're not thinking far enough into the future. You ought to be figuring out how to use this worldly wealth to create some true riches for you when you step into eternity. But if you're not trustworthy with this, why in the world would God trust you with true riches one day? He goes on to ask another question. He says, if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, implication, everything that's in my hand is actually not mine. It's somebody else's. Specifically, it's God's. This is how Jesus thought. If you've not been trustworthy with this temporary stuff that God's put in your hands for you to manage, then who will give you property of your own? Like one day in eternity, why would God reward you in that way if you couldn't handle this? Now, the implication of this is honestly a little bit scary at first. The implication of this is God's paying attention. He's paying attention to how I manage whatever he's given me to manage. He's paying attention to what I do with my worldly wealth. And apparently one day I'm going to give an account. He's going to be like, let's open up the books. I want to see how you managed it. I want to see what you did with it. But the thing I want you to be clear on, I don't want you to walk away feeling like, oh, that scares me to death. No. This was not Jesus' point to scare us into doing better. Jesus' point was to inform us so that we could experience the rewards he already wants to give us, that we just have to prove trustworthy enough to receive. That was his point. If I just summarize everything Jesus taught, his way of thinking about everything we have, it's just so different than us, isn't it? Because Jesus thinks of our worldly wealth in two ways. He thinks of it as a tool, and he thinks of it as a test. That everything you have and everything I have, apparently, is a tool that we can invest, a tool we can use to put into things and into people that are eternal, to have an impact on our eternity. Not where we're going to go when we die, that's not it at all. But on the experience we have, on the kind of riches God can entrust to us one day. It's a tool, and it's a test. It's our opportunity to prove we're trustworthy so that we can get called up to the big leagues, if you will, and handle more. This is what Jesus was teaching, and I don't know what all that means. And I don't even know how you should apply it, other than I know what it does for me is it causes me to evaluate how I naturally think about what I have. Because the way I think about it is influencing everything I do, all the decisions I make. And Jesus' point of this parable and this teaching was to mess with our minds and to go, no. You've adopted something that's just, in our case, the American way. It's natural. And it's running in the background. We don't even realize it's running. But we trust whoever or whatever we got that way of thinking from, and we trust it's the right way. And Jesus is going, there's actually a better way. The way you're trying to do it is never going to get you to where you want to go and help you experience what you want to experience. You'll have moments of happiness. You'll have moments of security. But then you'll turn around and have moments of insecurity and anxiety. Because as I said last week, whenever you live your life like this, whenever you live your life going, I have to prioritize myself first with my wealth. And I want to help other people, and I want to do something meaningful, and I want to make an impact, but I got to take care of all me first. Whenever you live like this is a scarcity mindset. All the weight to provide for you is on your shoulders. It's all on my shoulders. And you can't do this and not have anxiety. You can't do this and not experience insecurity. Because you can't, as much as you feel like you got to protect and consume and accumulate, you can't actually control all that. And Jesus was simply saying, there's a different way of thinking where you open it up and go, it's not mine. It's not mine to protect. It's not mine to consume it all. It's not mine to save it all. It's not mine to plan it all. It's not all on my shoulders. If I think like Jesus thinks about it, then I'm just going to align my thinking with what God wants to do with what he's put in my hands. I'm not an owner. I'm just a manager. I want to be better than the dishonest manager, but I want to be as smart as he is in terms of how he's planning for the future. I want to listen to what God has to say and manage this so well and invest it into things that are eternal so that one day he'll look at me and go, oh my gosh, you were so trustworthy with the little I gave you. So, this is anxiety. This is generosity. This is insecurity. This is joy. This is, I'm happy for a little bit, and then the new wears off or the thing wears off, and now I'm not happy anymore. This is, oh my gosh, I'm living a life with so much meaning and significance and purpose. So Jesus' way of thinking actually gets us to where we want to go. But it's scary to adopt his way of thinking to get there. It requires trust. So I just want to leave you with a couple of questions. I'm not going to ask you take some step, do some things. I don't know what you need to do with this. And even if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think it'd be worth wrestling with these questions because it just might be that if you change your way of thinking to Jesus' way of thinking, even if you don't believe in him yet, it would work for you and it would help you get to experience what you most want to experience in life. So this week, if this sticks with you, if it's causing you to scratch your head a little bit and go, what would that look like? Maybe these questions are worth you exploring. The first one is this. Am I using my money as a tool to invest in things that are eternal? And just do an audit of what you do with your money and your possessions. How often are you utilizing that to make an impact on God's purposes or on people in your world that you know are going to last forever? And then secondly, is this. Will I pass the test of managing well what God's given me? because we are going to be accountable one day. Now, before we wrap up, here's the pushback to all of this. And I'm just like you. I live in your world. I get this. The pushback is this scares us so much because I think if I prioritize other people before myself when it comes to what I have, I'll never have anything. And I'll never be able to buy a new car. Oh my gosh, I feel terrible about that because I should have given it to help somebody. And I'll never be able to buy a house or another house or, whatever. I had a buddy last week after the message. He was just joking, but he was like, you know what? Banks are going to be really busy. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, if we keep putting everybody else first, we're going to have a lot of foreclosures. I just kind of chuckled. But here's what we forget in all seriousness. All of that pushback in our heads. We push back because we have a scarcity mindset. Meanwhile, our Heavenly Father is going, I'm 100 times bigger than that billionaire. I got 1,000 times more things. You do this, you don't have to worry about we're going to run out of stuff. God says, I'll put whatever you need in your hands when you need it. And no, this isn't about giving every penny away. You don't have to give every penny away. You know why? Because God said He has given us everything we have for our enjoyment. That means He wants you to invest some of it in yourself. And He wants you to invest some of it in your family. Those are people, right? I know you wonder sometimes. Those are people. So yeah, you don't neglect them, but you know the difference. You know the motives going on in your heart just like I do in mine. You know when you're holding all of this loosely and trying to figure out how to invest it into other people and into God's purposes in the world, trying to invest it into things that are going to make a difference. And you know when you're like, I got to take care of me and what I need here and what I need here and what I need here. I would love to do that. And oh my gosh, when I make a little more money, you know that. When I have a little more, then you know that. And that's God's point. It's not about give it all away. It's about, will you hold it with open hands? Will you adopt His way of thinking about it? And will you just invite Him to guide you on where to put it? And then do it. And then do it. Here's what I know. Whoever you trust, whatever you trust, is going to shape your entire life. And if you do not put your trust in the right place, you will never find meaning in life. You'll be chasing happiness highs, one right after another. You'll never find meaning. Jesus, the one who came and gave His life for you, says, I want to invite you to think differently, not because He wants anything from us, but apparently because He wants to give true riches to us. And He wants us not to blow the chance to be trustworthy with this one shot we have at life. How you think influences what you do. You got to trust something. You got to trust someone. Who are you going to decide is worth trusting with what you have? Let me pray for us. Father, it's not easy for us, for sure. And if we take seriously what Jesus said here, His way of thinking is completely opposite of most of ours. So would you just help us, those of us who are followers of you at least, not to just dismiss this and lose track of it? Would you just keep bringing it back to mind? Because clearly, you're worth trusting, and clearly your motive is not to get anything from us. It's to give something to us. And what you want for us is a life where not only we prove we're trustworthy, but a life where we experience meaning and peace and joy. And it's not contingent on what's going on in our day. So wherever this lands with us individually, help us to have the wisdom to know that and the courage to actually act and do something about it. It's in your name we pray. Amen.